Welcome to Poetic Technique. Today we'll be talking about gestures. But not like that. Okay, so I just discovered that you can screen record your iPad, which is blowing my mind right now. And I haven't messed around with it a lot, but I'm going to be using that for a lot of this video, so be patient with me. All right, let me start my recording. Okay, here it goes. So I'm going to open up the poems that we have in our packet. But I guess before we start with that, I should introduce you to the main gestures. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. It's on your packet if you open up your Trappings of a Poem handout, which I'm going to do right now. You'll notice that I have 5 gestures that are listed, and I'm going to go through those real quickly here and just give general definitions. And then the goal for today is for us to look at these poems together and identify some of these gestures in the poems. It can be difficult, and one of the things that I want to emphasize is there are not always very clear demarcations between gestures where one begins and another ends. Sometimes they seem to operate almost like 2 at once or more, but we'll do our best to separate them today. So here's what they are. There's descriptive, which is pretty objective. You observe something, you describe what you see. The speaker may or may not come forward in those descriptions. It's just kind of like the environment or the setting, details. There are lyric gestures, which is gestures in poems that emote, that evoke feelings, or that's mainly it. There's the meditative gesture, which is a contemplation or an imagining, and a lot of times the meditative gesture as well as the lyric gesture can move across association. So this image is associated with this image, or this feeling is associated with this image, is associated with this feeling, etc. And those are some of the movements through the poem. So I might say, I don't know, coffee, energy. I don't know. I'm not good at writing poems on the spot like this. Coffee, energy, friendship. Those types of associations, please don't do what I just did, but those types of associations can move along lyric or meditative gestures. And then we have narrative, which is very familiar. That's when you're telling a story or you're communicating a plot. And finally, we have rhetorical gestures, which someone once said to me is probably the hardest gesture to master, and that's when you're thinking about or you're arguing for a certain idea. And these would all seem abstract if we didn't have examples of them. So let's go ahead and look directly at our reading. Sons of Achilles is the first poem in this packet, but it's also the only poem in the packet that contains all of the gestures. So let's, instead of starting with the first poem, let's come back to that and go ahead and flip down, to the weather in space. All right, the first thing that I want to identify is the punctuation here. Some things that might be helpful to note are immediately we're starting with question marks. Is God being or pure force? This is a question of concept. The wind or what commands it? A question of concept. And then look at this word right here, when our lives show and we can hold all that we love, it sprawls. So this is a logical chain. When leads to another action. This is very similar to the logical proof if then. If something happens, then something else happens. So when our lives show and we can hold all that we love, it sprawls. So sprawls would be the answer to that question. If this is the if, this is the then. Beautiful handwriting on my iPad. Thank you so much. And then you'll notice we'll have another example of when. When the storm kicks up and nothing is ours, we go chasing. If, then. And then what do we have here? After all, summary of argument. We're certain to lose, so alive. Faces radiant with panic. What's interesting here is that so far in this poem, the majority of the poem, we're operating along entirely rhetorical lines. Is God this? Is God this or that? And then if, then. And then a summary of the argument or a conclusion. After all, we're certain to lose, so alive. Faces radiant with panic. Here's a switch, a gestural switch from the rhetorical. So we have the first half is rhetorical to the lyric. Faces radiant with panic. You notice this is just evoking a thing. We have faces, an image, radiant, a specific image, with what? Panic. An evocation here. All right. If you need to pause and rewind, cool, go for it. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on to the next one. Yet No Less Grateful by Carl Phillips. Woke feeling like a minotaur, hot, torn, not so much undecided as undecided upon, and badly. What can I possibly do now about what I am, if I am what I am? So you'll notice immediately the language in this poem is largely abstraction. We have a minotaur, which is a specific image, hot, torn, so descriptions of that image. But then we move back into the abstractions. Feeling like what? Well, we're not feeling like an image. We're not feeling... the speaker of this poem is not continuing to explain how they're feeling based on additional images. This isn't a list. I woke up feeling like hot coffee spilled on a hand. That's not what we're doing. We're saying a minotaur, hot, torn, and then moving into abstraction. Not so much undecided as undecided upon, and badly. What can I possibly do now about what I am, if I am what I am? This has a lot of those trappings of rhetorical gestures. The comparison is foregrounded. We have not so much, which is, drawing attention to the conceptual, to the abstract. We have badly, which is another abstraction. What can I possibly do now? This verges on narrative without actually moving into any sort of temporality. So it's still the conceptual, if I'm what I am. All right, so we have another one of those comparative words, mistaking death for what's finally just proof of death. The latest stubbornly unvanished body beside the road that the wide, now sightless eye unstares across. All right, so let's pause here for a second. Like mistaking death for what's finally just proof of death. So the poem is differentiating between these two concepts. On the one hand, we have death. On the other hand, we have proof of death. And then it provides an example. It moves into this image, which is a stubbornly unvanished body beside the road. And it situates that within a couple of things. Within temporality, the latest, so as to suggest that there are multiple stubbornly unvanished bodies. And then in regard to some being, the sightless eye suggests some figure that is a subject that is verbing. The sightless eye does what? It unstares across. And then it moves back into this comparison between two things, death or proof of death. To rewrite what's been given is not refusal, is no one walking away. And then look at this next stanza. Between trust and what trust equals, between that and everything I say it does, why not do whatever? Well, we don't have to understand the logic in order to understand that this is a logical proof, or logical question, or this is a rhetorical movement. And then finally, in the last stanza, they say the difficulty with nothing but light, as with utter darkness, is not so much but that we are the waves stand frozen. Okay, so what do we have in terms of rhetorical movements? We have this right here is the concept. Then we have as, not so much, but that, we are. Okay. So this is some of the connective tissue that helps us move from one abstraction, one concept to the next. And then what do we have at the very end? We have a switch from this third person pronoun, all of the we that we have going on right in this section, back to, from the very beginning of the poem, the first person. I can't stop thinking of the future as the past imitating a god. Now, part of what makes the rhetorical gesture so hard is that it requires a hell of a lot of thinking. I mean, it is the thought stuff rather than the feeling stuff or the subconscious stuff or the telling stuff of language. So let's take a turn to a different type of gesture. By going, let's see, what should our next poem be? Let's go all the way down to Blackberry Picking. Seamus Heaney. Oh God, how do I do this? Okay. Okay. Blackberry Picking. Late August, given heavy rain and sun for a full week, the blackberries would ripen. At first, just one, among others. You ate that first one, and its flesh was sweet, like thickened wine. Summer's blood was in it, leaving stains upon the tongue and lust for picking. Then red ones inked up, and that hunger sent us out with milk cans, pea tins, jam pots, where briars scratched and wet grass bleached our boots. Round hayfields, cornfields, and potato drills, we trekked and picked until the cans were full, until the tinkling bottom had been covered with green eyes, and on top big dark blobs burned like a plate of eyes. Our hands were peppered with thorn pricks, our palms sticky as bluebeards. We hoarded the fresh berries in the byre, but when the bath was filled, we found a fur, a rat gray fungus glutting on our cachet. The juice was stinking too. Once off the bush, the fruit fermented, the sweet flesh would turn sour. I always felt like crying. It wasn't fair that all the lovely candles smelt of rot. Each year, I hoped they'd keep, knew they would not. Cool. So this is a narrative gesture, a poem that operates almost exclusively in narrative gestures. And how do we know that? Well, there are so many demarcations of time. There are so many verbs situated in relation to events unfolding. For a full week, that's a bigger stretch of time. The blackberries would ripen, and then it breaks it down into smaller stretches of time. At first, just one, among others. You ate, so more specific, telling a story, leaving stains. Then, you'll notice that some of the same words, then, for example, can be used in the rhetorical and the narrative gestures to completely different effects. If I say, if then, or set up a similar argument to if then that would be rhetorical. If I say then, and by that I mean moving through time, what should I do? Draw a little clock? Cool, a clock then. Then I'm operating in narrative gestures. Okay, then red ones sent us out. Briars scratched. Look at all these past tenses. Bleached, trekked, until, creating a little bit of tension. We did this until that happened. Until, creating more tension. Past tense. Our palms sticky. So there's an implied verb here. Our palms were sticky. Past tense. But when, creating some narrative tension. Found, past tense. Was stinking, once off, tension, past tense. Would turn. And then here, check this one out real quick. In the narrative, one of the ways that Haney ramps up the tension is not just by providing these sort of like untils, but whens, once offs, but also at the very end of the poem, moving into two different gestures, I always and each year. Notice that these only happen in the last 3 lines of the poem. Okay, That's it for narrative. I want to make sure that we can look at a variety of types of poems, types of gestures. So since we've looked at rhetorical and we've looked at narrative, let's flip to the kava poem, which operates in mainly the lyric and meditative spaces. So if you will, come with me to Portrait of the Alcoholic Floating in Space with Severed Umbilicus. I'm going to take some coffee. In Fort Wayne, I drank the seniors. Okay, so it looks narrative, right? In Fort Wayne, I did this thing. But then what does it move to? Old Milwaukee, Old Crow, examples of the thing just provided. In Indianapolis, I stopped. Okay, so I did this, verb 1, and then what? I stopped. Okay, well, that's not a whole story, is it? That's a moment. It's a moment in time, certainly. But then it moves to a completely different place very suddenly. It's not interested or invested in telling that one part of the story. It might suggest a moment in time as a way of evoking the emotional focus of the poem, but it's not staying in that moment. Now, I regret every drink I never took. Okay, so at this point, we've established the argument, or at least an argument of this poem, which is 1, I drink. 2, I regret. Specifically, the speaker regrets not drinking more. All around, coffee grounds and eggshells. This all around moves us to the present moment. So we've had the past so far, and then the now brings us to this present moment. Now I regret. All around, so this is gesturing to the surroundings, coffee grounds and eggshells. The sweating, a mouthful of lime. So again, this is evoking. It's using different parts of storytelling, such as sensual descriptions, some verbs, moving immediately into examples of what's stated. In Fort Wayne, I drank the seniors. What are the seniors? Well, they are Old Milwaukee, Old Crow. And then to another moment, in Indianapolis, I stopped. So that's immediately like signaling to us that we're not investing in a narrative poem here. Now I regret every drink I never took. Even though we have the trappings of narrative, we're moving from then to the present moment. It moves just as quickly as it moved into what seems like it could be a story, back into these sort of like scattershot impressions all around, or associative images, to use a less loaded term. All around, coffee grounds and eggshells, the sweating, a mouthful of lime. We have images that are associating feelings, sensual feelings, with what the poem's focusing on. And then another jump in time. As a boy, I stole a mint green bra from a laundromat. I took it home to try on while my parents slept, filled its cups with the smallest turnips in our pantry. The underwear grew into me like a strangler fig. My blood roiled then as now. So this section right here, this is certainly a narrative moment. I did this thing. Here's me reflecting on a thing that I did. But what's its purpose? It's serving the purpose of my blood roiled then as now. Back on Earth, frog spit is dripping down wild aloe spikes. Salmon are bullying their way upstream. There is a pond. Okay, I leapt into once with a lonely blonde boy. What do these have to do with the story? What do these images have to do with the story? Well, the speaker will go on to say, I leapt into a pond with a boy. One of us fell in love. I wonder where he is now. And what the hell does that have to do with drinking the seniors? If we're looking for a story, we're going to expect some degree of continuity there. I drank the seniors, here's where I started, this is what happened next. But that's not the point of this poem. It's creating these impressions so that it can build upon an emotional or evocative experience. This is a present moment poem. I wonder is where we are now. I wish is where we are now. So let's keep looking. When we scampered out, one of us was in love. I could not be held responsible for desire. He could not be held at all. I wonder where he is now. If he looked up, he might see me. So remember where we are. The speaker is literally in space with what? A severed umbilical cord. Creepy and fabulous. So if the old Old almost lover looked up now. I wonder if you might see me. And what am I? I am a sparkling. And then remember in the Haney poem where at the very end we move into this different temporality, I always hoped. So we've had these past tense things so far: stole, roiled, wonder. No, that's not past tense. Hoped. Okay. And then we move into I always hoped that when I died I would know why. And then it moves into a different temporal setting. Okay, the thing that, like, I'm looking at so many different parts of what's going on here. The thing that I hope I'm communicating is the lack of continuity in terms of temporality, in terms of tense, in terms of narrative, in terms of rhetoric. This is, for example, if we're thinking of descriptive poems, it provides descriptions. Frog spit is dripping down wild aloe spikes. Mwah, beautiful. But that's not its primary impulse. If we think about lyric, that's what we're doing. If we think about meditative, which is contemplating or imagining, we have those moments. I think this speaker is thinking about associations between things like types of drinks and in his present setting, coffee grounds and eggshells. Whether or not we take that literally is another thing. If we think about the narrative, yes, we absolutely have telling, we have plot here, but they're moments. They're more like it's more like a montage of recollection in service of the experience of the present moment of the poem. And if we think about rhetoric, do we have rhetoric here? A little bit, yeah. Yes, I could not be held responsible for desire. He could not be held at all. It's narrative lyric or narrative rhetoric, but there's not a lot there. The point is, we have these different gestures. We have different modes of temporality, but the primary thrust of this poem, the primary means of cohesion, is this emotional or evocative impulse to communicate an experience, a present moment experience. So what do we have at the end? We have, I wish my brother, I wish he were here now. He could be here. This cave is big enough for everyone. Look at all the diamonds. Not a moment in time, right? But a feeling. And it ends the poem, in case you forgot that this is a highly lyric poem, it ends in the present moment. It says, I wish he could be here. And then it looks out. It experiences the setting. Sorry if my mic just kerfluffled. Okay, I've been, going through these poems, thinking out loud, trying to highlight things as I think they might be useful. I hope my iPad recording worked first time. We have a few more poems in this packet. One of the things that I want to mention is, though we have meditative gestures in some of these poems, I don't have a single poem in here whose primary impulse is meditative in terms of gesture. But what you might look at is the way that Kava's poem has meditative connective tissue, or how Sons of Achilles has these meditative moments. I am an apprentice in a city named Kiss the Hands Who Kill, and Achilles is the father, for one example. Go through these poems, or if you want to, go through some of the earlier poems. And you don't have to take notes on this part, or you can, but you're not required to take notes or share your thoughts on this part. But go through and see if you can identify some of these gestures. If you spend some time with this, if you spend just a little bit of time trying to figure out how to identify differences between, how to differentiate between these different gestures, I guarantee you it will change the way that you have conversation, the way that you hear people communicating meaning. It's remarkable to me that when I start thinking along these lines of like descriptive, lyric, meditative, narrative, rhetorical, etc., people's intentions become pretty transparent. If someone is telling me a story, there are a few reasons why they would want to tell me a story. If they're using rhetorical language, that evinces something about their motives for speaking to me in that moment. If they're using purely descriptive language, what does that teach me about the emotional distance that they're either experiencing or attempting to project between themselves and the experience that they're describing? And what's so cool is that once you get these little bugs in your ear, oh, gross. Sorry, that was a physical image. Ugh. Once you get these ideas in your head, I don't even know what I was gonna say now because of the daggum image of the bug. Whatever, just think about it. The one thing that I would encourage you to do is go back to that first poem in the packet, to Nabi's Sons of Achilles. It's an eponymous poem from her fabulous first collection. I would highly suggest getting it. See where you can identify these different gestures. There are three that she relies on most heavily, which are rhetorical, narrative, and lyric. So if you can't identify the meditative or the descriptive, that's fine. But see at the very least if you can note where she brings narrative storytelling and evocation into this poem. All right, I'm going to sign off. Otherwise, I'm going to talk for the rest of the day about these things. I'll see you next class. Oh yeah, we're talking about the sonnet. We're gonna incorporate a lot of this learning, these different gestures, what we've talked about in terms of speaker and audience. We'll be incorporating all of that and talking a little bit more about specifics of craft, things like the volta, musicality, etc. So I'll see you then.